Hi, I'm Dr. Hank Greenwald. I'm an equine veterinarian, retired in 2020, quite a year. I'm doing a little video here for the Lewis Conservation District, and they'd like me to talk about some basics of nutrition. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to kind of start at the end. And when you make a feed decision, you should make that based on somebody that actually knows what they're talking about. That usually means someone that has actually specific training in feeding a horse. So people you kind of want to be careful about are, let's say, your trainer, the guy you meet on the trail ride, the clerks at the feed store. You have access to a lot of people with education on how to feed a horse properly. A lot of these larger feed companies, you can actually call them up. You can talk to a PhD nutritionist and they can help you, guide you on your feed decisions. So when you're feeding a horse, you always want to feed by weight, not by volume. So if somebody is feeding hay, like, oh, they get X flakes. Well, is that flake 3 pounds or 5 pounds or 7 pounds? So the way to accurately feed it is to weigh it every time. I know it's difficult, but it's the way to go. If you're at a barn and you can't, let's say the barn owners won't weigh the hay for you every time, what you can do is you can pre-weigh out the hay, put it in feed sacks, so when it comes time to feed your horse, if they're fed in meals, then they can just put that already pre-measured amount in. So feed by weight. You want to be careful in your feed area, keep it clean. A lot of these old barns, you get corners, the feed gets wet, it gets moldy, the horse gets down there, they breathe in those fungal spores and all that stuff, or they eat food that has been decaying. Not a good deal, not good eats. So keep that area clean. If you feed on the ground, that's great, but put a mat down. Don't put it on the rocks, don't put it on the sand. That's not digestible and it can cause some serious problems. We like to feed our horses on a regular schedule, if possible. Yeah, it'd be great to have them eat and have a constant small amount of food on a regular basis. But in truth, that's a very difficult thing to do. So some people talk about feeding your horse ad libitum, in other words, feeding them, just having hay in front of them all the time. Problem is, we get a lot of fat horses. There's a thought that animals will eat to their gut fill and then they will stop eating, but I have a horse here that proves otherwise. He's chubby and it's hard to keep the weight off him. He's a half Clydesdale and he likes his meal. He likes every meal. So we want to feed on a regular schedule. There are some automatic feeders. There's some ways to do it. There's some slow feeders. There's netting. There's a lot of different options for that. If we're going to do changes in our feed, we'd like to do them slowly. By slowly, I mean, let's say 10 to 14 days. And the reason for that is horses are hindgut fermenters. So if you rapidly change what they're trying to digest, they don't have the fauna, the flora, the enzymes to digest that properly. They will tend to ferment rather than digest. It can lead to colic. So just be kind to your horse. When you get a new load of hay in, it's nice to have some of the old hay so you can mix it. I know at a lot of barns that's not possible, but try to do that. And then feeding your horses individuals. I have 3 horses. Each one of them gets a different diet. They get a different diet because their metabolism is different. The amount of energy that they expend is different. One of them retired, so he doesn't need the caloric amount. But he's also older, so maybe he has a little malabsorption, so maybe he needs more of a different feed to compensate for that. So think about feeding them individually. So we want to usually feed based on a body condition score, but we're going to save that for another video. So I made Kelly happy. So, but normally for horses, you're thinking of hay, roughage. It's the main part of the diet, and it's really important to feed it. And it allows them chew time, it fills their stomach. Horses are kind of interesting as they're not like humans or dogs. I mean, somebody sees something, dog sees something that looks good and they start salivating. Horses don't salivate like that. Horses only produce saliva while they're eating. Now they can produce maybe 10 gallons a day, a tremendous amount, and that's really important because of course we're all worried about our horses and their ulcers. And one of the things about the saliva, it has a buffering action. And so by feeding them on a regular basis, and that helps to produce that saliva, helps buffer them. Maximum roughage in the diet. I'm a real believer in that. Most of the horses, unless they're doing some extreme work, you want to keep the carbohydrates down. And most of the things that the biggest offenders in the carbohydrate world are cereal grains. So when we talk about grain, I'm talking about actually the seed head of a grass. I know horse people, and they talk about what the grain is, but what they talk about grain is they just mean anything that comes out of a feed sack. And that's not grain. Grain is specifically divided as like corn, oats, barley, those kinds of things. So we want to minimize those concentrates too. And the reason we want to minimize them is we have seen with experiments that if you feed too high a percentage of their diet in concentrates, they're more prone to colic. And none of us want a colicky horse. Okay, so we want to get the basics. We're talking water. Water is important, but you know, not all water is good water. And so, and some of these horses, or excuse me, on some of these farms, we might want to run a water test. We want to know, you know, are there bacteria in the water? Is there too much iron in the water? Is there other contaminants in the water that may affect our horses? So water, not all water is created equal, but it certainly is important. The roughage, hay, pasture, pellets, great, that's where we want to go. Iodized salt, why? Because we need a little bit of that iodine for our, you know, for our thyroid function. We don't need a lot, but we need a little. The salt, because we sweat, and those are two of our major electrolytes. Talk about electrolytes and electrolyte supplements. We'll also wait. We'll put that in the list with the body condition scoring. Vitamin mineral supplement. Okay, it would be nice if we could feed 100% pure roughage, and then we could just throw them out on the grass and everything would be good. But we know that our hay in the Pacific Northwest and our grass in the Pacific Northwest is not nutritionally complete. The two major things we're lacking is going to be our selenium and our zinc. And so we need to make sure that we get a good supplement that's going to supply those deficiencies. And that's the main thing. So we can actually keep our supplements really simple. They don't have to have 20,000 things in them. I mean, there's kind of like, well, what the horses need and what do you have to put in a supplement to sell a lot of supplement. And so you need to figure that out. And that's where it's really good to talk to someone that knows a lot about nutrition. Now, if they know a lot about nutrition and they're also trying to sell you a product, which is usually the case, then you just need to be able to sort and look at what they say. So when we talk about in nutrition, we're talking about elements, we're talking about compounds, or things that the horse or we can digest, they can be absorbed, they can be metabolized. You are what you eat. It's really true. So we talk about 6 essential nutrients, and that would be water. We already talked about that. Carbohydrates, fats, protein are the next 3, and they're kind of in their special thing because that's where we get our calories and that's where we get our energy from. We get our vitamins. Vitamins are these cool little molecules that help catalyze reactions. And so we need and we don't make vitamins usually. So most of the vitamins we need to eat. And minerals. So we can talk about that a little more. Water, it'd be great to have free choice water. Hot weather, they drink more water. Make sure it's palatable and potable water. Carbohydrates, really big field here. When we talk about carbohydrates, we go from everywhere from simple sugars to monosaccharides to disaccharides, more complex sugars which we need to break down. You know, one of the great examples of that would be like the lactate milk we get for people. It tastes sweet because they've taken a sugar that is with 2 sugars, they've cleaved them, And so now you taste the sugar, the simple sugar. And the reason they do that is some people can't digest the complex sugar, and then it ferments and people aren't happy. So that's kind of like a little example of carbohydrates. And then we get into more complex starches and polysaccharides, all the way up to lignin. Lignin is the carbohydrate that makes trees hard. Or if you get alfalfa, why does alfalfa get stemmy? Well, that stem is the lignin. So if you think about like feeding alfalfa, what's all the nutrition? It's all in the leaf. The stem's like eating wood, and that's why a lot of horses leave it. So it's okay.
So I have a question about feeding horses in the Pacific Northwest to help prevent founder.
Okay, well, that's a huge topic, and I've worked a lot on foundered horses. I was a farrier for 10 years before I was a veterinarian, and so I still do a lot of founder work. So, you know, our main worry is carbohydrates. So back in the old days, probably before you were born, people used to think it was the high protein that caused laminitis, and we really know that's not the case at all. And actually, for a laminated horse, oftentimes what you want to feed is alfalfa, which has a higher protein, because alfalfa almost 100% of the time has fewer carbohydrates than the grass hay that you're feeding. So I mean, we can run tests, we can find out if they've got a metabolic syndrome, or we call it insulin dysregulation. We can run tests to find out if they have like what we normally call equine Cushing's disease, PPID.
So one thing that some people have said, because we have a lot of pasture graze systems in Washington, is grazing at different times of the day.
Absolutely. So the way grass works, and you probably know more about this than I do, is so any grass that gets stressed is going to produce more carbohydrates. So the way grass works is during the day, as the temperature comes up, as the sun comes up, as the weather is good, the grass is producing carbohydrates. So during the day, those carbohydrates get increase, and then, and the sun goes down, so long as it's more than 40 degrees at night, those carbohydrates get transferred and converted into a more complex carbohydrate, the starches. So those starches are less readily available, so they're much safer to eat. So probably the time to put your horses out would be very early in the morning. You know, this is interesting because it also happens for like just hay, you're haying. So you're cutting a huge field of hay, you're out there all day long. The stuff you cut in the morning is going to have a different carbohydrate level, different part of the field, than the stuff you cut in the afternoon or the evening. So yeah, that's a huge thing. And so we want to limit. Also, the stress of the grass has to do with how well is it watered, how well is it fertilized, how tall is the grass. The shorter grass, if you've ever seen horses and you get a pasture and they're all eating the shortest grass. Well, why are they eating the shortest grass? Well, it's the sweetest. So the taller grass is not nearly as sweet. And so that's a thing. That's why in pasture maintenance, we want to mow, we'd like that grass at least 3 inches tall. And we'd like to mow it, to harrow it, to keep it more even. So, yeah.
All right, thank you.
Did that get you?
Yeah, it did.
All right. So we talked about carbohydrates. You know what? Carbohydrates is such a big thing. You can get your PhD and spend your whole life just studying carbohydrates. So we're not going to go crazy about carbohydrates. I think you can put up the little visual of how complex carbohydrates are. They're really incredible. Okay, fat. What about fat in horses' diet? Can horses eat fat? Yeah, it's not a normal part of their diet. And if you look at what's in grass, there's not a lot of fat in grass. But what fat is in grass is really good fat. And what does that mean? We got good fats and not so good fats. So the good fats we think of are usually these omega-3 fats. And that has to just do with the chemistry and where the chain is and where the groups are. The omega-6 fats typically are not so good. And the reason for that has to do with the arachidonic acid and the inflammatory cascade, and how the fats break down to form our cytokines and our inflammatory mediators. Probably more chemistry than you guys want. That being said, omega-3s are good. So what's high in omega-3s? Well, grass is really high in omega-3. A lot of the fish oils and the krills are high in omega-3s. What things are high in omega-6s? Oh, corn oil. You know, how many people feed corn oil thinking it's a really good oil for horse, but it's sort of pro-inflammatory. I mean, there's a lot of fats out there. So it depends why you're feeding the fat. Most of the time we're feeding the fat for energy. But for us to use fat as a good energy source, we need to get our digestive system conditioned to use it over time. But there's been some very interesting research on feeding fat. We know it's a really safe thing to feed if the horse will eat it. I mean, up to a cup or two a day. Oh, wow. I mean, quite a bit of fat, way more than we would feed in a normal diet. But we have some of these horses with like a polysaccharide storage myopathy, a GYS1 positive gene, and they can't deal with the carbohydrates, so we need to get calories into them another way. And fat is a really safe way to do it. There's been some research that's shown it kind of has a calming effect. Unfortunately, in some horses, it can have a little diarrhea effect because it's too much to digest, but it's a really good thing to do. It does, like I say, it does take some weeks, and you kind of want to ramp it up. And if you're going to do that, the fats that you would buy in bulk, let's say you go to your big box store, you could think about like soybean oil would be a good one, canola oil would be a good one. But you kind of want to, you know, a lot of horse guys are feeding corn oil, is not that good. So we look at protein, CHON, carbohydrate, carbon, oxygen, hydrogen, and nitrogen. I'll say that in order. Carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen. So the big deal is the nitrogen. And so when we look at a feed tag, what's the first thing most people think a horse feed in their feed tag, what comes in a bag is, well, what's the protein level? What's probably the least important thing on that feed tag? It's the protein level. And because that's crude protein. So all I have to do is grind up shoe leather and put it in there, and that will get our crude protein up there. But it doesn't mean it's digestible, and it doesn't mean it's a very high quality protein. So when I talk about high quality protein, what do I mean? I'm talking about the amino acid balance. So horses' protein requirements are actually pretty low, 8, 9, 10% of their diet, way lower than ours. But what's really important is the amino acid balance. And a couple of these big companies have done some studies, and they've looked at the amino acid balance, and they've formulated special feeds that are going to help the horse. So why are amino acids important? So if we want to put fat on a horse, we can feed them carbohydrates or we can feed them fat, and that'll put fat. But if we want to put muscle on the horse and we want to have structural proteins made out of or structural parts of the horse made out of protein, then we need to feed the appropriate amino acids. So the famous example is it's really old, there's like a wooden barrel, and each one of the staves is cut at different levels, and you try to put water in it, but it can only fill as low as the lowest stave that got cut off. And that's how amino acids work, is they work in conjunction with each other. So the limiting amino acid, the one that you don't have enough of, makes all the other ones irrelevant, and you're never going to fill the barrel. So that's the kind of way to look at that. So when we talk about proteins, we want to talk about quality of protein, not necessarily quantity of protein. So vitamins, like I say, they're catalysts, they're coenzymes, they facilitate metabolic actions in the horse. Where's a really good source of vitamins? Well, vitamin D would be our sunlight. Vitamin B, the horse can actually make. There's a whole bunch of vitamin Bs. We're not going to go into those right now. Again, you could get your PhD in it and spend your life's work just looking at vitamin Bs. Vitamin A and E are usually in the grass, green grass. And so they're in the hay, but they're not in the hay for very long. So they go away. So that's one of those things we want to look at our supplement that we're giving the horse and make sure the vitamin A's and the E's are good. Vitamin D's, not seen a lot of research on vitamin D's, but being in the sunlight, which of course we have issues with in the Pacific Northwest, make vitamin D challenging. I already talked about in the Pacific Northwest, we're pretty much deficient in our zinc, we're deficient in our selenium, we need to supplement those. So, but how do we know? Well, this is where hay testing comes in. So what we want to do is figure out what's in the hay, what's in our roughage, or even for that matter, what's in our grass, which is a lot harder to test than hay. And then we want to supplement that and bring that up to nutritional levels that are adequate.
Do horses get anything from over-fertilizing the grass? Like cattle can get metabolic diseases from over-fertilized grass?
Yeah, we can get like a nitrogen or nitrate toxicity and that kind of stuff. And we can actually get if we would fertilize our fields with zinc and selenium and it would get taken up in the grass, then we'd be good. But nobody does that, at least nobody that I know of. So we could make our grasses nutritionally complete. And that's always a problem, because what we'll typically do with our pastures and our farms are we grow up the product, we cut it off. Do we replace all the nutrients and everything we've taken out of the soil? Well, some guys do, but some guys don't. And how do you know? Well, you don't. So when you do your hay testing, you need to have somebody come out, core sample a bunch of bales, and there's a specific way you do it. You need a lot of bales, you mix it all together, and you send it off to the lab, and the lab comes back with an analysis.
So the conservation district can do that. We have the sampling equipment. Yep. Great.
Yeah, so coring is important. It would be nice if every farmer that grew hay would give you a nutritional analysis with the hay, but you just don't see it. And I don't know why, because it really doesn't cost very much. But also, like I say, remember, one bale to the next and one corner of the field to the next and what time of day, all that changes. So it's hard. Luckily, what we've got a lot of really good PhD nutritionists that work for these larger companies that do a great job of formulating these feeds. So if you want a supplement, you want to go with one of the companies that has actually looked at what's going on, especially locally. So you don't necessarily want a supplement that was designed for whatever alfalfa or whatever they're feeding in California. You would like something that's appropriate for us. There's minerals, minerals, big deal. Macro minerals, micro minerals. So the macro minerals, and I'm just going to talk about two: calcium, phosphorus, because that's like the big daddy of macro minerals, because that's what we need for our bones and our balance in our life. And so one of the common mistakes, what are the most common mistakes in feeding that I see? Well, usually it's people that buy a horse a senior feed and then don't feed enough of it. That's probably number one, because nobody reads the feed tags. But maybe feed tags is another talk. We'll just line up all the talks. Calcium, phosphorus, why is this so important? It's because what I'll see a lot of times are people will be feeding a grass hay and they'll feed something like a cob, corn, oats, barley. What's the problem with that? Well, grass has got pretty much a perfect balance of calcium to phosphorus, and that's really good. But all your seed heads, all your grains have an inverted ratio. So they have not nearly enough calcium and way too much phosphorus. So the horses eat that. And in the old days, they used to get a disease called Miller's disease or Brand disease or big head. And it's called nutritional secondary hyperparathyroidism. It's not going to be on the test. But what happens is the body doesn't have enough calcium to run all the things it needs calcium for. So you need calcium for a lot of the metabolic functions in the body, the clotting of the blood, to build strong bones. So the body goes, I'm out of luck here. I've got to steal some calcium from somewhere, or else we're going to be in a bad way. And so it starts taking calcium out of the bones. And consequently, the bones start to get enlarged to try to make themselves strong enough. And that's consequently why you get the actually big head. The horse's head would actually enlarge because the miller would feed the bran. And the bran is a grain product, and it's very high in carbohydrates, but it's also very high in phosphorus. And so you get this imbalance. And so this is really important. Now, if you're feeding alfalfa, which is super high in calcium and low in phosphorus, then that can counteract that. But I just see that all the time, and I've seen it recommended, and it's like, just like, don't go there. Don't go there. It's one of those. For formulating a ration, what do we need? Well, we need energy. So we've got, I mean, there's all these different things to look at. If we look at carbohydrates and proteins, they're about 4.5 megacalories per kilogram of feed. Fat is like twice that. So fat is our most energy dense food. So, and proteins have a cost. To break down proteins into calories is much more difficult too. So the body has to work harder for that. Here's our body condition score chart, which you will put in now. And so there's different ways of going. We usually use a 9-point scale, and we're using it physical signs on the horse. We can catch up the horse and point out some, but you can do it at the chart too. So what the main places we're going to look is we're going to look at the neck. Is the neck cresty? Do they have a big fat pad behind their shoulder? Do they have fat up on the top of their butt and around their tuberococci? Can you feel their ribs? What's the covering of the ribs? I mean, if you know about a horse, they don't really have fat on the outside of their ribs. Their skin, and there's actual muscles in the skin, which is why they can shake it, but they don't have like an inch of, of muscle there. So if it's all spongy, and that's how you tell. I mean, if muscle has a certain feel, fat has a different feel. It's more jiggly. And then if you have a horse that's got edema or fluid, you push and it'll maintain the indentation. So when you do your palpation, you can determine that. If you want, you can put up the anatomy, the foregut 39%, the hindgut 61%. Talk about sort of the stomach of the horse. Not a very big thing, 2 or 3 gallons. So when you go treat a horse for colic, you're limited on how much fluid you can put in that stomach and how fast. Well, actually, you can actually put it in pretty fast, but that's a whole different thing. There's a gastrocolonic reflex. So as you stretch the stomach, it can get your motility increased. So sometimes you'll actually put it in fast, but that's colic. That's a whole different thing. And then where things get absorbed and how quickly they get absorbed. And if we have like a grain overload, well, most of the grain, if we're feeding it, which frankly most horses do not need, gets absorbed in the small intestine. But if it bypasses the small intestine and gets into the hindgut, now it starts to ferment, and we can get a hindgut acidosis, we can get gas, we can have other problems. Again, we can get colic, we can get laminitis, we can get all kinds of bad things. I should bring out my skull. We can talk about the mouth, but that's probably another talk too. We already talked about
talks forever here.
There's talks forever. That's the cool thing about science, is it's never done, and all it does is lead you down the path to more and more questions. So beware of the person that knows too much.